All right. Welcome, comrades. How are you keeping? Thank you for joining us this evening, or this afternoon, depending on where you are, for what's certain to be a hugely informative and educational discussion with Esperanza. Esperanza is an activist and organizer, a member of the anti-imperialists transnational feminist organization Affirm, with a 3, AF3IRM, as well as a contributing editor with Twink Revolution. She gave an incredible talk with the Colony Youth Movement fairly recently, and everyone in the attendance was blown away by the depth and clarity of Esperanza's scientific socialist analyses. As well as giving talks and engaging in educational sessions internationally, she regularly writes about all things proletarian feminist and anti imperialist and publishes her work on Medium, which you'll find linked in the description box below. So, Esperanza, thank you for taking the time out to come on the stream. Please introduce yourself to the audience, tell people a little bit about your background, your political work, your political ideology, and how you came to the left more generally.
All right. Hi, comrades. Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me on. I've, watched your stream for a while, and so really excited to be talking with you here. So I guess, providing some background on who I am and how I came to be a revolutionary communist and a proletarian feminist. Growing up, sort of working class. I was never really politicized. I live within the United States, specifically within California, and, dealt with a lot of, issues. For example, my dad being targeted by the state. They tried to deport him multiple times, incarcerated him, struggled with housing insecurity, but I never really understood those problems as political problems. I understood them as perhaps individual failures. And it wasn't until I dropped out of high school and, went to community college that I really started to get politicized, although I was not yet a Marxist. But I did sort of start developing a class analysis and a more political understanding of the state. Um, I still was not an organizer. It wasn't until I, transferred to my four-year university and I was on a scholarship. I ended up getting harassed and targeted by the campus police for being the only transgender student. And I had filed complaints and nothing happened. And one of my friends who was a hotel worker and organized and unionized his workplace, he said, "You have to organize." I did not know what organizing was. I was like, "Do you mean like how secretaries organize, or what exactly do you mean by organizing?" And he explained to me, right now you have no power as an individual, but if you unite with people and you speak together in one voice, that is where your power comes from. But like many workers, many people, I was very afraid because the scholarship gave me my housing, my education, etc. But I decided, to do it anyways. We ended up organizing, giving demands to the administration, and we ended up connecting with the workers who were fighting for their own union. And the workers showed up to support my struggle. I organized students to support their struggle. That ended up bringing me into the labor movement. Where I organized hotel workers, food service workers, fast food workers, you know, healthcare workers. But I realized that there was something missing from the labor movement, which I later came to realize was that it was very economistic. It was in the hands of the, bourgeois Democratic Party, et cetera. And through realizing those limitations of the labor movement, as well as being organized by some communists within the labor movement, that is where I first really started to discover and study Marx and Lenin. And so that's sort of how I came to, communism, realizing, the failures and the problems with the labor movement, as well as with, the sort of general political trends. I ended up coming to proletarian feminism after spending some time in the sex trade, where I really experienced why liberal feminist arguments were so bankrupt. And that is how, I discovered JMP, I discovered Anuradha Gandhi, Hisila Yami, and I started to really study what is proletarian feminism, and furthermore, what is the Marxist or the revolutionary communist approach to the question of women, of women's emancipation, of the commodification of women, and of male violence.
Wow, uh, there's a lot there, and it's really interesting how you started from more of uh, you identified a lot of problems as kind of like individual problems. I don't want to say individualistic, but you started from this kind of perspective, and then you gradually moved over towards a more collectivistic, systematic analysis. Through the labour movement, there's similar problems as well with the labour movement in Ireland. The economism is everywhere. There is no revolutionary labour movement in many cases in Ireland. It has been defanged by the 1990 Industrial Relations Act here, unfortunately, and it really leaves revolutionary communism as the only viable path forward. Some would argue that that's the only viable path forward anyway, but it's very clear in places like this, you know. It was also very interesting that, JMP, you've been reading your JMP, your Anuradha Gandhi, these are very transformative figures in terms of my own education as well, and I really vibe and gel with everything you're saying there. So that's a really really good introduction to this. I will say for people who are watching this, for the viewers, that there is a little reading list in the description box below, and I just want to draw your attention to that because this whole topic, this whole conversation about proletarian feminism. It can be often quite difficult to come to terms with for a lot of people. There's a lot of confusion, people will often think, when they think feminism, they might think liberal feminism, they might think like radical feminism or radfem or something like that. And we're really trying to carve out a new space here, proletarian feminism, which has been there in the communist movement throughout. And there are some really key, fundamental, and really important texts that you should be reading. And you'll find those linked in the description box below. Writers like Colin Toy, like Anuradha Gandhi, and you'll find links to those texts. So find them in the description box below. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's get into the big question here. You mentioned that you really discovered the limitations of liberal feminism while you were working in the sex trade. What is proletarian feminism there, and then how did this, I suppose, offer solutions where liberal feminism failed? So what is proletarian feminism?
Yeah, so proletarian feminism is a new or an emergent kind of feminism that is distinctly communist. And that is distinctly revolutionary. It was coined by Anuradha Gandhi, developed by Hisila Yami, or sometimes known as Comrade Parvati, and attempts have been made to further conduct social investigation and practice in order to develop, synthesize, and clarify proletarian feminism. It is not simply a mode of analysis, but it is also a practice that aims to recruit and develop women cadre in order to both take leadership within revolutionary movements, but also to unite with our male comrades in order to fight our common enemy.
Powerful, and I really like how it's situated within the revolutionary communist movement from the start, and I think that this is a really, really important avenue for us, in the same way that in Ireland, socialist republicanism fuses the national question and the social question together within a scientific socialist analysis. Proletarian feminism fuses women's emancipation and the social question using that materialist conception of historical development. It's this understanding that the movement for the emancipation of women is inseparable from the struggle for social emancipation, that is the class struggle. And I'm reminded of this really great quote from Alexandra Kollontai, 1909, The Social Basis of the Woman Question, which, by the way, thank you for recommending that I read this. That's been on my reading list for a really long time, and I read this recently in preparation for the stream. One of the quotes in it was that the followers of historical materialism reject the existence of a special woman question separate from the general social question of our day. Specific economic factors were behind the subordination of women. Natural qualities have been a secondary factor in this process. Only the complete disappearance of these factors, only the evolution of those forces which at some point in the past gave rise to the subjection of women, is able in a fundamental way to influence and change their social position. In other words, women can become truly free and equal only in a world organised along new social and productive lines. The history of the struggle of the working women for better conditions of labour and for a more decent life is the history of the struggle of the proletariat for its liberation. I love that. I love how it's just so firmly nested within the revolutionary communist struggle to abolish class society once and for all. You know, I really, really appreciate that kind of situation of this area, you know. Sorry, that's my.
Definitely.
I didn't end that very well. Situation of this area, but yeah. So I think that that's a really nice place to a really nice way of sort of situating this conversation. You know, one of the things that people will sometimes come at this conversation with the question of proletarian feminism is that this topic of class reductionism. You know, I think that that's probably important to just, I suppose, nip right in the bud right now. I would say that rather than being class reductionist, proletarian feminism incorporates the struggle for women's emancipation in its totality into the class struggle. You know, but moving forward to get a firmer grasp of what proletarian feminism is, I think we have to understand what it isn't. You know, it's not liberal feminism and it's not radical feminism as such. And I know there are, of course, many other trends within feminism. There are other strains. There's, you know, you've got your postmodern kind of approaches, anarcho-feminism. There are a few different kind of schools, ecofeminism, all these kinds of things. But generally, I think it's a good idea to maybe situate it in opposition to liberal feminism and radical feminism, and to see what more proletarian feminism brings to the table. So let's flesh this out a little bit more now. How does proletarian feminism differ from liberal feminism?
Yeah, so I guess to start out, right, liberalism is based on intense individualism, right? We understand that liberalism is the ideology of the bourgeoisie. Liberalism is an ideology that was developed to accompany the new social relations under capitalism, right?
Mm.
In order to sort of justify, the social relations needed for the free market, sort of free trade, etc. So naturally, right, liberalism focuses intensely on individual rights. It's also very ahistorical in a sense that, you know, when you hear liberal feminist arguments today, for example, I think one of the best examples is around the sex trade, is that it's completely ahistorical, right? It doesn't take into account how these institutions developed, where they originated from, and how they exist in actual reality.
Mm.
Uh, it focuses on formal equality, on form, but not on essence. It is very reformist. It believes that the state is neutral and that the current system just simply needs to be tweaked a little bit, um, rather than sort of completely smashed and remade. Um, but I also think that it's important to say that a lot of what we might consider or what we might consider to be liberal feminism today is also very much postmodern feminism.
Mm.
In many ways, like postmodernism and liberalism have really merged into what we call like sort of liberal feminism. So you'll see that like postmodern feminism is also very much obsessed with identities, obsessed with difference, fragmentation, particularity. Um, and so we see, like, if you read Anuradha Gandhi's Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement, she separates postmodernism from liberal feminism. But what we see today, I think, is very much a meshing of both of them into one kind of feminism that perhaps considers itself to be radical, but is not.
Mm. I love this that they're now referring to this kind of radical centrism. That's my favorite term in the world. And really spot on analysis as well of this kind of merging of postmodernism into liberalism, and this, I suppose, this ultra focus, this hyper focus on identity. And we can start talking about like identity politics. We can start talking about kind of intersectionality and all these sorts of things, and maybe some of the shortcomings of these kinds of movements. I don't want to be too critical, because often the people who uphold these kinds of things are often very well meaning and very well intentioned, and really do care. They just don't necessarily have this sort of materialist understanding of socio-historical development. And that can cause all kinds of errors. Errors like, for example, as you say, this idea that the state is neutral. This is the quintessential kind of social democratic understanding of the state. It's just kind of this neutral arbiter that doesn't have any explicit class interests. It's not just the tools used for class oppression by one class against another class. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And also, one other thing that I think was really important that you mentioned is this obsession with sort of difference and fragmentation, and how sometimes we can get a little bit lost within that. You have a million different kind of identity markers, and unfortunately, we can kind of get lost. We're not situating this all within a class struggle, and there are limitations in terms of the revolutionary potential that actually has. It can get very hyper individualistic, and that can cause all kinds of problems in terms of actually solving the problems. It can seem to solve the problems. It can kind of, the solutions it offers within this kind of liberal postmodern feminist kind of framework, the solutions that it offers, they often come down to kind of individualistic lifestylist solutions based around changing language, the words that are used all the time, rather than actually changing the relations of production, which would give rise to these kinds of oppressions. So I think that it's really important.
Absolutely.
Sorry. I think it's really important that we do sort of frame that, and we do highlight those points.
Yeah, absolutely. And while I also think a lot of people that maybe call themselves intersectional feminists or things like that are well intentioned, I also think it's really important for us to critique and struggle against those trends. For example, with intersectional feminism, it's very much sort of a reiteration of postmodernism. And Anuradha Gandhi, critiques that also in her book, where she talks about how, under postmodernism, we separate ourselves into the most smallest categories that we can, and we all have our perceived oppressor. And then we struggle against that perceived oppressor. And then it develops into what JMP would call movementivism, which is that if we're all struggling against our perceived oppressor, somehow that is supposed to result in some revolutionary transformation of society. This is something that I argue against all the time. For example, I often have people saying, for me as a trans person, that I should consider all non-trans people to be my oppressor, that it is cisgender men and cisgender women that are oppressing me. And this is an idea that I thoroughly and wholesale reject and disagree with. When you read Alexandra Kollontai, for example, she says, yes, women do experience the double weight of oppression, right? We experience both capitalist exploitation and oppression, and we also experience the weight of the patriarchal vestiges that still exist in our society. Proletarian woman knows who our real enemy is. It is not proletarian men who are women's enemy. It is capitalism. It is the capitalist class, the imperialists, who are our enemy. And so I think that what this intersectional feminism does is it obscures who the real enemy is. Because what it does is it says, if you are a person of color, all white people are your oppressor. If you are a woman, all men are your oppressor. If you are trans, all non-trans people are your oppressor. And if you have a disability, all able-bodied people are your oppressor. And I think that we need to completely reframe that into understanding who our real enemy is, who has the power to maintain the current system of oppression and exploitation. And so that's why I think it's important to, sort of struggle against that ideology.
Yeah, really, really concise analysis there. I really appreciate that. And it's what you're talking about there. These are really kind of like, you'll end up with really shallow solutions from the kind of analysis that is presented with these through like intersectional feminism and all sorts of things. Unfortunately, the solutions become very shallow. You often get these kinds of how can I say this, representation politics become like the solutions, as long as we have, I don't know, the most oppressed minority is the, I don't know, president of the United States or CEO or whatever it might be. That's kind of the solution, and that's everything kind of fixed, and in a way, unfortunately, this can kind of really, it can kind of satiate the popular desire to overcome oppression through these very shallow representation politics. And unfortunately, you can kind of divert attention away from a genuine revolutionary struggle. And you can have people, unfortunately, throwing their support behind right wing pseudo feminists, let's call them that, like Hillary Clinton, who really are just protecting the class interests of the bourgeoisie. And this is one of the fundamental problems of these kinds of right wing approaches to feminism or centrist approaches to feminism, is that it really is completely detached from the class struggle and can often see itself as completely detached from systemic oppression. And of course, this comes from the very individualistic and reformist kind of roots of this form of attempted women's liberation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see it too in terms of what their focus is. So, for example, I, being in the labor movement, I've sort of rotated between labor unions and these worker centers. Now, worker centers are like these sort of like nonprofit entities that attempt to organize workers. I personally believe they fail at doing so. But what you notice is that there is this sort of like language that these people use when they talk about like social justice and
Mm.
intersectionality. For example, we talk about like, who's responsible for perpetuating things. We talk a lot about discourse. We focus a lot on words. And yet what that does is it obscures who our real enemy is. We know that as communists, as revolutionaries, we have to remold ourselves. That means we have to fight against racist ideologies, sexist ideologies, like,
Mm.
all of these incorrect and chauvinistic ideas that we grew up in. But at the same time, what I think this like sort of postmodernism does is it makes us point fingers at each other and consider each other the enemy rather than pointing fingers at who is actually responsible, right? And who
Yeah.
actually has the power. And I think that's like sort of my biggest problem with it.
Mm. That was the mic drop moment. That was so good. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It does obscure the common oppressor. You're not looking at you're not looking at the bourgeoisie when you're seeing every person you meet on the street as as some kind of oppressor of another. And unfortunately, I mean, this is kind of a misunderstanding of contradiction and principal contradictions and all these kinds of issues. Which I think is where communism really comes in and communist theory really comes in and can really help us to come to grips with the main problems. Give us that real strong historical materialist understanding of socio-historical development, and help us to see who the people who are really holding the cards and who are really the ones who are holding the power and are able to enact serious change, and they're the ones who are doing the oppressing of us right now. So thank you for that, and also always very interesting to discuss this idea of the discourse, this conversations are in discourse and changing the words, and so on and so forth, which, as you said, and I think you framed it very well, we do need to do all that stuff to varying degrees as well, and as much as we possibly can as communists. Unfortunately, sometimes you do see communists going like the other way, going in the opposite direction, where they'll realize the errors of liberal feminism, and they can often just go in a very reactionary direction from there. And
Mhm.
so it is important that we do say that we're not rejecting the liberation struggles among any of what would be called within intersectionality, like these axes of oppression within this kind of intersectional framework. Of course, we're all absolutely united in the fight against racism, sexism, transphobia,
Yes.
everything. We're absolutely there. It's just we need a better way of solving these problems, and we don't see that the solutions offered by
Yeah.
intersectionality are enough, that they can't actually solve the problems that they identify.
Yeah, and if I could just briefly touch on that too,
Mm,
that is also what I consider to be a very reactionary trend, which is where people, like you said, the pendulum sort of swings exactly in the opposite direction. And then
yeah.
people consider any discussion of things that are not superficially like class to be a distraction. So you see,
Mm,
for example, leftists arguing that all talks of racism are a psyop or
yep.
all talks of sexism. Like that's simply not true, right?
Yep.
And to say, like, for example, we know who our real enemy is not to say that we will accept or allow male sexual assault or sexual violence within our organizations, or that we will allow white supremacist ideas or people who subscribe to white supremacism or white supremacy to be in our organizations. Like those things have to be fiercely struggled against, fiercely challenged, and we
Yeah.
have to remold ourselves. Uh, so that is not what I mean by saying we know who our real enemy is. I just feel the need to clarify that because there is a trend,
Yeah.
especially among the online left, that does subscribe to that idea.
Oh yeah, yeah, and it causes all kinds of problems. And you do see as well. We're going to talk a little bit in a moment. We're going to talk a little bit about like radical feminism. That seems to be like the alternative that a lot of people in, especially in the UK as well, a lot of communists in the UK, people who call themselves communists tend to gravitate towards radical feminism, which in many ways breaks with Marxism, and I think we'll get into that in a little bit. But it takes on very very reactionary positions, and unfortunately, it's like no, we're saying is no, it's not that we need to go back. It's that we need to go further. We need to go beyond intersectionality, and we recognize that these problems do still exist. We just we need to solve them within the context of the social struggle, of the class struggle, within the struggle to end class society once and for all. Uniting people
Yeah.
within the class struggle, I suppose, rather than just shutting down all of these other kinds of struggles. So yeah, let's maybe dive into that next question. Let's talk a little bit about radical feminism. How does proletarian feminism differ from radical feminism?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is that I appreciate a lot of the contributions that radical feminism has made to our understanding of women's oppression, as well as their persistence in not retreating on certain issues, such as the commercial sexual exploitation of women or surrogacy, things like that.
Mm.
However, another thing I'll say is that we should also recognize that radical feminism also shares some roots with Maoism, in that, uh, two of the first radical feminist groups explicitly wrote that they were inspired and motivated by the Cultural Revolution. So we do have that connection. At the same time, however, I think that as Marxists, it's important for us to recognize what is incorrect about the general or popular trends within radical feminism. So the first thing I'll say is the idea that the category women is a class, or that genders are classes.
Mm.
We do not consider women and men to be separate classes, right? That's sort of like a vulgarization of, Marx and Engels applied to gender analysis.
Mm.
You might read that, if you look at, for example, like Catherine McKinnon's work. Although I do have a lot of respect for her, what she's written on other subjects, I disagree with her that, women is a class. Um, Unlike radical feminists, we do not consider the main contradiction or the primary contradiction to be between men and women. We understand the primary contradiction to be class, right? We live in a class society. The primary contradiction is class. So we also reject the idea that women of different classes share the same interests and that they can unite around a common program into a singular revolutionary movement. So if you read Alexandra Kollontai, The Social Basis of the Women's Question, she talks about, the context that she wrote it was right before the first all women's conference in Russia. And bourgeois feminism was very popular at that time. And they were uniting around this slogan, women of all classes unite. And so, you know, her book at the time was an intervention into this class collaborationist feminism. And that is exactly what we see with radical feminism, as well as I would say, some other kinds of feminism today, right? Which is that they believe that all women, regardless of class, share in a common oppression and have the same interests. And proletarian feminists reject that. We argue that proletarian women have more to gain by uniting with proletarian men than we do by uniting with women of the exploiting classes. When bourgeois women fight for equal rights, they know that the masses of women are not going to be able to share in those equal rights. But what they also know is that it will allow them individual advancement and success, right?
Mm.
And so proletarian feminism understands that, like Kwame Ture said, progress is not made by an individual advancing in the system. Progress is made when the masses of people advance. And so unless the masses of women, which are necessarily women from the exploiting classes, advance, then there is no progress for women. Another thing that we differ with radical feminism is that radical feminism usually considers patriarchy to be the main system, right? That all men oppress women and some men oppress other men. Well, proletarian feminists understand that patriarchy has taken different forms in different times. We do not consider, for example, this double-headed beast theory that there's capitalism and patriarchy and they're two separate systems. Oftentimes you'll, hear people talk about like there's a system of patriarchy, a system of capitalism, a system of white supremacy, all these different systems, but they're all ill-defined and not scientifically defined.
Mm.
We understand capitalism and patriarchy to not be two separate systems, right? We understand that capitalism is women's enemy, and that within the advanced capitalist nations, patriarchy, as it existed as a system of patrilineal property laws where women were legally considered property, we understand that that does not exist anymore, but that patriarchy exists as vestiges within the superstructure of our society that continue to deform the base. However, of course, it's important to note that within semi-feudal nations, that's not necessarily the case, where, for example, where feudalism is still present, patriarchy as it is still present, right? But for the rest of us, patriarchal social relations are preserved within the capitalist mode of production. But the system is capitalism, right?
Mm. Mm.
And then I guess the last thing is that we understand that women's emancipation is not possible without communism. And so we cannot achieve women's emancipation without, transitioning to communism.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's a really, really good point, and it really gets back to what the root cause of women's oppression and women's subjugation is. And unfortunately, it seems to me, and I know when it comes to the discussion of of radical feminism, we kind of necessarily need to deal with what are, I suppose, let's say, straw people, because obviously there's such a vast spectrum of people who are, radical feminists with very different perspectives. But one of the issues is situating the root of women's oppression in an incorrect place, not situating it in relation to the means of production. And it's really, women's emancipation writers, communist writers, have got this right. Colin Tye got this right in 1909. She understood and she explicated on this point about how we need to fundamentally change these social relations of production if we want this emancipation of women. We can't just do it in some sort of superstructural way. We can't just achieve women's emancipation under capitalism. It's impossible. The system necessitates it. That being said, you pointed out, you raised a really important point, that the contradiction between women and men and so on existed long before capitalism. So in some cases, as you said, I believe, I think you said this anyway. Maybe I'm wrong. That the contradiction between men and women is kind of treated as the principal contradiction, and historically, this is treated as the principal contradiction, and unfortunately, that's a little bit ahistorical. We understand it as a secondary contradiction, even though it's a contradiction that spans all throughout history. It's a secondary contradiction in that it's shaped by the primary contradiction, in that it's shaped by the economic mode of production, and you did a really, really good job of highlighting that and explaining like how that works, because obviously patriarchy was different in feudalism than how it sort of manifests under capitalism. So I think that's a really, really important point. I also really like that you brought up the question of women as a class. I had written that down as well as a point that I really wanted to address, because it's something that I've seen cropping up time and time again with communists. Again, I'm very close to the UK, very, very close to Turf Island, as they call it. And this point of women being a class really breaks with Marxism, and it really is important that we address this straight off. Look, let's get it clear. Like, there is a rationale for doing this. If you say that women are a class, then you can say that all struggle for feminism is some kind of class struggle, and you can sort of say that you are engaging in a revolutionary class struggle with any kind of feminist organizing. But this really breaks from the Marxist-Leninist Maoist, from the scientific socialist understanding of class, just the standard Marxist definition of class, even going back to like Engels. But particularly, I think that Lenin does a really, really good job of explaining, what a class is. But let's just put this in context for people who are saying that women are a class. By this understanding, a woman who owns a factory and exploits workers, extracting and appropriating the surplus value of the proletariat, is not the same class as a man who does this, which is ridiculous because both are clearly bourgeois. There isn't a separate class for bourgeois men and bourgeois women. As Lenin says in A Great Beginning from 1919, classes are large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production, by their relation, in most cases fixed and formulated in law, to the means of production, by their role in the social organization of labour, and consequently by the dimensions of the share of social wealth of which they dispose and the mode of acquiring it. Classes are groups of people, one of which can appropriate the labour of another, owing to the different places they occupy in a definite system of social economy. So look, if you call yourself a Leninist by any shape or form, you got to be aware that this position that women are a class is really breaking with a Leninist position. It's really breaking with the Marxist understanding of class. It's almost as silly as kind of like liberal interpretations of class, where class is just purely the amount of money you make, and if you're making, like, I don't know, 20,000 per year, you're middle class. And so there's no need for class struggle. Everybody's kind of in the middle, and so on and so forth. It's not basing itself on the relations of production. It's not basing itself materially on this Marxist perspective, And I think that this is a massive problem for communists, because obscuring the primary contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is extremely counter-revolutionary, as it misguides the masses. For any successful revolutionary movement, we need to be able to clearly identify the exploiters and oppressors who are to be overthrown. And in the context of capitalism, that's the collective proletarian overthrow of the bourgeoisie, regardless of the gender of the oppressing class. Okay, so Hillary Clinton is very much her class enemy. Gender, sex, that doesn't come into it in terms of this particular question. So yeah, that was a thought that I had there. I'm not sure if you had anything more to say on that point.
Yeah, no, I think that this is a very important point to understand, and I think that it's also related to part of the problem of focusing on women's role in reproduction over women's role in social production. And the reason why is because if you simply look at women's role within the family, then you are not understanding why it is necessary for women of the exploiting classes to be able to seize the means of production, because you're missing the importance of the question of who controls wealth. who controls the production and distribution of wealth and resources, because that determines who has the power. And so, some socialist feminists, for example, within the academy, often focus primarily on, women's role within reproduction and downplayed women's role within social production. And that is a mistake that was pointed out by Anuradha Gandhi, and that we should continue pointing out today, because the question of women's emancipation, as Gandhi says, is not merely an economic question, but it is also a political question. And being a political question, it has everything to do with who controls the production of wealth and resources in our society.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. It is very important that there's kind of a little bit of a sleight of hand. There's a little bit of a sleight of hand that goes on there when the focus is shifted to reproduction. And it can often sort of mislead us and misguide us, and I think that it is important to highlight that. You also highlighted as well that there is sometimes another kind of sleight of hand, a kind of sending people in the wrong direction, where we sort of focus on the oppression of women as being a result of the division of labor rather than being as a result of the relation to property and private property, historically, and how that developed. So I think that these are some common traps that we fall into, and even on the sort of socialist feminist spectrum, the Marxist feminist spectrum, and I know we're kind of using those terms with very specific meanings, the Avanti meanings, the Anuradha Gandhi meanings from philosophical trends in the feminist movements. So I would recommend everybody read that book for more on those categories, because it'll make a lot more sense if you do. Because it can be confusing as well, because we're calling out Marxist feminists, and here we are talking about Marxism and feminism, and it can be pretty confusing, So do check that out. Anyway, these are all really, really good points. With regard to this question of proletarian feminism and how it differs from radical feminism, again, I apologize if I'm doing kind of straw persons here, but I think it is important that radical feminism, as opposed to liberal feminism, can appear to be both collectivistic and revolutionary. It can definitely appear that way. As you mentioned earlier on, it was inspired by Maoism, or the early forms of Maoism, not necessarily Maoism qua Maoism as we understand it now, but Cultural Revolution and so on and so forth. And this can be very attractive to communists, because it does appear to be quite collectivistic. It does appear to be quite revolutionary. However, in practice, it often is reformist, preferring to work within the capitalist system rather than to overthrow it. I would also say that it's not actually radical in the true sense of the term. The word radical etymologically means that you're getting to the root of something, the root cause, and that it doesn't actually get to the objective root cause of women's oppression. In locating the root cause of women's oppression, it often relies on strange forms of essentialism, and sometimes that's a biological essentialism, which leads to TERFs. Sometimes that's a psychological, metaphysical essentialism that imbues women with such characteristics as being loving, peaceful, caring, etc. There's often talk about a kind of a feminine essence or a feminine nature. It doesn't explain why or how women have come to be associated with these characteristics, and it doesn't explain how this fits into the development of class society using a historical materialist analysis. And this can often have some pretty I suppose pacifying results that don't really get anywhere. Like, for example, if you have this idea that women are naturally compassionate and caring, then that's going to be an impediment to for example, revolutionary armed struggle. You can't even consider that, violence is this masculine thing, and so you can get into some pretty strange metaphysical areas when you really start following that path down too far. Again, I don't mean to imply that all radical feminists do subscribe to these areas, but I have seen these kinds of talking points brought up, and it can get a little bit a little bit strange,
Yeah. And I think that's just one other thing that I did want to address about radical feminism, is that I think that the mistaken idea that the primary contradiction is between men and women, and specifically between males and females, I think leads them into both a sort of biological essentialism that, then leads them into transphobia. it's always been interesting to me why both radical feminists as well as, like sort of postmodern trans activists do not consider themselves to have similar interests. I mean, we are both oppressed by the same systems, the same people, right? But I think that this focus on difference and this mistaken analysis of the primary contradiction, as well as this biological essentialism, leads them into transphobia. And I think that even is more of a reason why we, as Marxists, as revolutionary communists, need to be pushing the idea that class is primary and pointing our fingers at the real enemy, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and also offering the solution for dealing with that, because while radical feminism can seem very radical and revolutionary, it can often fall into reformism and it can often fall into lifestylism. For example, like examples of like an individualist lifestylist solution to these kinds of issues, correctly identified problems, real problems that do exist, but there can be a lifestylist kind of solution that is proposed to these issues. Like, for example, people being encouraged to simply individually change their lifestyles and personal behaviors in order to solve these collective problems, which really doesn't solve the problem, the collective problem, political problem that we all face. And of course, reformism is another issue of making exclusive reformist demands for this or that within the current economic order. As you said, because the primary contradiction is seen as patriarchy, it doesn't really matter what system it's almost like it doesn't matter what kind of system it's solved under. We just need to solve it and get that done, and that this doesn't necessitate the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, which of course, as we know as Marxists, is the only way of actually solving this problem and bringing about emancipation for women. So yeah, that's brilliant. I really appreciate that, and I also do think it's really important that as revolutionary communists, we do have clear paths forward to overcome these issues that aren't reformist or individualists. As you said, this proletarian feminism can be a really good way of sort of onboarding people into the revolutionary communist movement. We don't need to get into specifically how you go about doing revolutionary communism. We're on YouTube here, don't want to get in trouble. But yeah, definitely there are. The solution is probably not going to come through the ballot box, So I think proletarian feminism recognizes and deals with that reality. All right, so one of the last big questions that I really wanted to discuss before we take a few Q&As, before we do a few Q&As with the audience. And by the way, for people watching this, if you want to ask a few questions, just make sure to type at Paul Moran at the start of your question, and then I'll see it, it'll be highlighted, I'll take it down, and we'll address them after this. The last big question that I wanted to ask, sorry, there's a slight bit of interference just coming through there. I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, there we go, problem solved. The last big question I wanted to ask is, do we need feminism? Doesn't Marxism already cover the emancipation of women? And this is a very contested point. It's a very contentious issue within Marxist circles. For example, you'll read Kollontai and she's always railing on against the feminists. Those damn feminists, James Connolly as well, in his writing, he would also, while being very pro women's emancipation and being very fighting for that militantly, they would still complain about feminism. It was as though this is already encapsulated within Marxism, within the revolutionary Marxist tradition, so we don't even need to worry about it. We don't even need to call it feminism. It can just be women's emancipation. It can't be women's liberation though, because that's co-opted by the libs, so which is again another thing that you hear as well. You can't talk about women's liberation, you can't talk about feminism. It's already included within Marxism. What do you think? Is this ridiculous? How should we approach this as revolutionaries?
Yeah, so, I don't necessarily think it's ridiculous. I mean, I think that these are important questions that we have to grapple with. I would say that my answer to that simply is that we absolutely do need a proletarian, communist, and revolutionary feminism. While Marxism does, in fact, provide a sort of broad and general answer as to the emancipation of women, there's two things. One is that it still needs to be developed, and two is that there are some very important considerations that we need to take into account. The first, for example, is that, after Engels wrote his book, there were some new anthropological and historical evidence that came out. Anuradha Gandhi writes about this in Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement, and Gerda Lerner was the historian who really, sort of put this all of this evidence together in her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, which is that there is some very strong evidence to suggest that it was the uh, appropriation of women's sexual and reproductive capacities that preceded private property. And so, if that is true, right, we as Marxists are scientific socialists. We do not follow dogma like it's a religion. So, if this evidence is correct, then that requires us to really sit with that and think about what that means, that the appropriation of women's sexual and reproductive capacities preceded and set the basis for private property. Additionally, I think that we need to look at how many revolutionary organizations have been unraveled by patriarchal ideas, by male chauvinism, how that has limited the participation of women and thus really shot themselves in the foot. I think we need to look at how the parties and revolutionary movements that have developed or adopted proletarian feminism have had a historic participation of women cadre. You look at what happened in Nepal, you look at the Maoists in India, you even look at the Maoist Party in Canada, and how they've all had a sort of strong participation of women cadre. And so my answer to that would be yes, I think we absolutely do need to be feminists, but not bourgeois feminists and not petty bourgeois feminists, but proletarian feminists that understand that women's emancipation is only possible under communism, but that the woman question cannot come second and it cannot come last. It really has to be at the forefront of our analysis. Additionally, that the recruitment and development of women cadre is incredibly important. This is something that Hisila Yami developed in her book, Women's Liberation and People's War in Nepal, which is that women face this sort of double exploitation or double oppression, and therefore are that much more likely to see a revolution through to its completion. And so I think, yes, we need to stand for the total and full emancipation of women. We have to struggle against class collaborationist and bourgeois feminism, but that we also have to understand that the emancipation of women will not come solely by overthrowing capitalism and transitioning to socialism and communism, but that we need multiple cultural revolutions and an ideology and a practice that can allow us to uproot the oldest extra class oppression in the world.
Absolutely, hard agree there. You do often have people who want to ignore other forms of oppression and exploitation that exists. People who don't want to address, for example, the colonial question, the national question, things like this. They don't want to address gender oppression, LGBTQ plus oppression. They don't want to deal. They just want to focus on the class issue, and they sort of say, well, we're dealing with class. Everything else will come later, and it is important that we keep pushing for this, and we keep pushing for women's emancipation within historical materialist analysis. As you said, really importantly, there are massive issues with patriarchal oppression even within the communist movement. There's misogyny all over the place. I mean, just even think about in the last year or two, so many cases have come out about we can say abuses within various organizations all over the world, and how they've been handled as well, which is often in a very kind of buddy kind of way, which is really fucked up. So we need to be handling these issues. We need to be dealing with these issues head on. It's not something that we can just kind of put to the side and not worry about. What is it? Women, 51% of the population is women, something like that. If we're not addressing women's emancipation, then how the fuck can we call ourselves communists? How the fuck can we call ourselves socialists? Socialists for 49%? No, I don't think so. And as you said, I think there's a really important tradition there within, especially like MLM organizations as well, who've really upheld proletarian feminism, And there's a question as well. This is kind of, I know I'm going to jump on the gun a little bit, but there was a question in the live chat there. if we could maybe distinguish between Marxist feminism, or the sort of ideological trend of Marxist feminism, and proletarian feminism. This is from IP Gaming MP1, and this might be actually a good time to address that, because my understanding is that proletarian feminism is often a lot more explicitly tied to class struggle, to revolutionary struggle. It's actually forged in the heat of class struggle in many ways, whereas Marxist feminism can often seem like a little bit more of an academic, kind of detached kind of thing. That's kind of how I perceive it generally, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would say that is absolutely correct, right? So we see that Marxist feminism is a term that largely developed in or around the academy, that it's not necessarily developed during a revolutionary period, in conjunction with revolutionary practice, that it was, a sort of early attempt to merge Marxism and feminism. Um, and I think that there are things that we can learn from Marxist feminists, people who identify as that, but that the value of proletarian feminism is that this is something that developed out of actual revolutionary struggle, right? This is something that developed out of, people who were making revolution in their own countries and who were actively working on the recruitment and development of women cadre, on fighting bourgeois feminism, fighting patriarchal feudal lords, fighting these capitalists, and so proletarian feminism does not simply develop in a classroom or in a book. It develops during periods of revolutionary practice. And so proletarian feminism is in many ways a return to, the revolutionary aspect of what it means to be a communist. And also, it's not really separable from Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, or from dialectical and historical materialism.
Mm. For, as JMP would say, forged in the crucible of class struggle. I love the way he describes that. Crucible of class struggle. Very much not something that was just an academic, intellectual jousting match, but very much focused on actually addressing real concrete issues within the proletarian movement internationally. And actually, there's a good question about this. Jess asked a really, really good question to talk a little bit more about women-led revolutionary movements that are happening right now, and I think we'll come to that a little bit later. I'm really looking forward to it. That's going to tie in very nicely to this particular point. But the next question that we were asked before we jump into that, and we will circle back to it. Volti asked, quick one here for you now. Volti M asked, Paul, who is in the picture behind Esperanza? Not Lenin, the other one.
Charu Majumdar, and basically he was one of the people who initiated the armed struggle in India, which is now the Communist Party of India Maoists, the Naxalites. And so there's a lot of things that he said that I love. I know if you go to Foreign Language Press, they have his book, The Historic 8 Documents, which you should read, because I think it contains a lot of analysis and points that really help us think through the problems we're dealing with today.
Absolutely. Big shout out to our comrades over at Foreign Language Press, doing amazing work, making revolutionary theory available to the masses for free. All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. You get asked, actually. I remember at the CYM event a month or two ago, people were asking you who's on your shirt and stuff like that. You get a lot of questions about the figures behind you. No one's ever asked me about the figures behind me. I suppose they see Lenin and they think that's it. That's enough. But there's pressure there, I suppose, to have a good explanation. All right, great. So you mentioned a little bit about the Naxals and their struggle. I think this is we're gonna circle back to that now and dive into the real world struggle. I'm excited about this question. Jessidiah, and by the way, thank you, Jessidiah, for recommending that Kolontai text. Finally got around to reading it for this stream. Amazing text. Jessidiah, at Paul Maran, would Esperanza speak on women-led revolutionary movements that are happening now? So women-led revolutionary movements that are happening right now.
Yeah, so I think that there are, many different movements that we could talk about and analyze. I'll say that one of the things, or one of the movements that I'm sort of inspired by is, the women-led organizations in the Philippines right now that are fighting against Duterte. and that also, are really developing an analysis of what it means to be a woman who is oppressed by feudalism, capitalism, and imperialism, who are fighting to organize other women in the fight against these systems, but not simply to fight against all men, etc., but to unite with their male comrades in order to, realize a new democracy and a new system. Um, and also, I just want to address one of the comments in the chat that's like, is she trans? I always find these questions so funny because it's like, I feel like I can say, yes, I'm trans, I'm trans, I'm trans so many times and I'll still get questions about it. But yes, to, satisfy your curiosity.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm sorry that you keep on getting asked that over and over and over again. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, and a good shout out to the comrades in the NPA and engaged in militant struggle right now. It is very interesting that the Maoist movements, the People's Wars, often have an extremely high percentage of women in the movement as well, like with the Naxals as well. I think it's something like 60% of the activists, the revolutionary militants, are women, which I think is very interesting when you look at a lot of the revisionist communist formations, and it's kind of like 95% just a bunch of dudes sitting around, So there's something that's not quite right there. There's some issue with theory and praxis that needs to be addressed, and I think that it really is, as you said. I mean, it's just fusing within proletarian feminism with the MLN movement that I think has to be central, and that'll help get us to women's emancipation more broadly. All right, so thank you very much for answering that, and thank you for the question, Destoya. Spooky Scary Socialists. Great, comrade. Good to have you here. Paul Moran got a question for Esperanza. What are her thoughts on LGBT issues and its relation to communist organizing? Also, as a trans person, has this affected her outlook on proletarian feminism?
Yeah, so this question makes me think to an interview I recently did with Ray from Bahagari, which is a organization in the Philippines that's organizing LGBT people from the exploited classes. And something that I really appreciated from our interview is that she talks about how for LGBT people to be free from these oppressive ideologies and practices and ideas in our society, we do need socialism. And I think you see this very clearly. I mean, you look at the Philippines, for example, the first gay marriage was performed by the revolutionary government, right? By the MPA. And it's still not legal in the Philippines. You look at, for example, the first, sex change operation was developed in the USSR, right? I think that capitalist countries, even so-called advanced liberal democracies like the US, we're still struggling to give LGBT people, LGBT youth, women just simply basic rights. And I think it's very clear that capitalism is so reactionary and regressive that it's not able to guarantee us what we need. And so for me, I realized that at first I was very influenced by postmodernism. And so I was very focused on queer and trans activism. But I realized that unless we're actually fighting for communism, and unless we actually name our enemy as the ruling class and its state, that we're always going to be fighting into a dead end, right? And that ultimately we need to sort of go beyond these, individual sort of identity movements and coalesce into something bigger. But that being said, I also think that, there are a lot of, communist parties that really fail on the LGBT question. For example, look at the communists in Britain and the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, they're horrible on this question, and so I think
all too well.
Yeah, and I have people influenced by them and their analyses all the time come into my mentions and make all of these horrible comments against me. But I do think that there's this sort of one that the LGBT movement needs to realize that there is no LGBT community ignorant of class, right? We are separated into antagonistic social classes, but then also communists need to realize that many communists have failed to address questions regarding LGBT people, and there needs to be a serious and genuine attempt to answer that. And I'm sorry if maybe that doesn't answer the question, you know, with specificity. So please let me know if like there is something more you wanted me to talk about.
No, it was a really good sort of introduction to some of the big issues that are faced, within the communist movement on LGBTQ plus issues and so on and so forth. And it is a big problem that I see all the time. Ireland as well, like being this sort of semi-colonial country, still very much influenced by the UK, and still colonially occupied in the 6 counties and the north of Ireland. There is a sense that some people will still look up to the communists in Britain, even within the communist movement, will still look up to the communists in Britain as kind of like a I don't know, somehow kind of like better, superior. Like we still see ourselves as kind of like lesser. I suppose this is kind of like a colonial mentality. And we're still sort of like looking towards them for answers and solutions. And unfortunately, some of the comrades here in Ireland look towards that and they see these extremely reactionary LGBTQ plus positions, and they sort of assume that the communists in Britain are correct in their analyses. They're kind of seen as like the big brothers or something like that, which is a huge problem, and something that needs to be combated quite militantly within our movement. So thank you very much for the question. Spooky Scary Socialist says your answer was great, loved it, and I'll check out that interview later. All right, so I realized that there was one question we were going to address before we finished up, and it talked about how people can get engaged and organized and involved within the proletarian feminist struggle. We'll circle back to that. Maybe we'll take just 2 more questions, 2 more Q&As, and then we'll circle back to that final question and finish up. Is that okay with you?
Definitely.
Great. Okay, so there's 2 last questions here. Cornelius Fabian Ousted Perrier? I don't know, I can't pronounce. I'm trying anyway. Paul, to Esperanza, what particular conditions would we have to change to rid our movements and eventually our societies from patriarchy? And how could we do that in the specifics? We can't be too specific because I think we'll get kicked off YouTube if we do. But as far as we can go without getting ourselves into legal trouble.
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a huge question that perhaps I'm not qualified to answer in its totality, but what I can say about that is sorry, let me just get that question up. Is so, when you talk about what do we need to do to rid our movements from patriarchy, well, let me just give you one brief anecdote and then talk about what I think we need to do. So I was in a, sort of MLM study group where we would like study twice a week, and we would also train, and we would also go out and organize, right, and also like immerse ourselves into like the different protest movements in the area, do social investigation, etc. And we did not initially really focus on the question of patriarchy or on the question of women's emancipation. And what ended up happening is that it ended up later blowing up in our faces. There was issues around like male violence, specifically male sexual violence, among 2 different men in the group. And what we had realized is that, when Alexandra Kollontai says that the woman's question is not separate from the general social question, sometimes that can be interpreted as saying, oh, we just need to focus on the general social question. But what I think that means, and from my experience, is that we need to also put the women's question first, because it is not separate from the general social question. So without understanding women's emancipation, without understanding patriarchy, you are not going to have a real understanding of the general social question. And so I think that we need to make questions of patriarchy and violence against women some of the first things that we struggle with. And I think it is not just something that needs to be reflected in our courses of study, although it absolutely does, but also in the very structure of our organization. It needs to be recognized that we all are sort of indoctrinated into a patriarchal society, a society that views women as commodities, a society that normalizes violence against women. And therefore, these things need to be struggled against from the very beginning, even from the people that we believe are the most well-meaning. And if we fail to do so, it is not the responsibility of the individual alone, but it is the responsibility of the party, of the organization, of the movement for not prioritizing that. And so I think that, that's one thing. I think another thing is that we need to actively struggle against, patriarchal ideology and male chauvinism. And I don't think that we should just simply dismiss concerns over patriarchy, over male chauvinism, over racism, for example, as coming after class or as alienating parts of the working class. I think that we need to take them up first and foremost.
Yeah, hard agree.
And,
Hard
and
agree.
then in terms of like eliminating patriarchy from society, well, I mean, obviously I'm a revolutionary communist, so you likely know my answer. We cannot do that under capitalism. Capitalism and its ruling class and its state maintains patriarchal social relations. So we need to move beyond capitalism, ultimately need communism, but we also cannot just expect to, have a socialist state and suddenly eradicate all of this. That's why we need multiple cultural revolutions that can uproot and struggle against these ideologies and ideas that are so prevalent in our society.
Hard agree. In the chat, I see Ryan Lennon fan says join a Maoist org. That's the answer. Yeah, join a Maoist org. But even within that, obviously there needs to be work. A lot of work needs to be done. I will say that within MLM there does seem to be the tools to correct the errors. For example, rectification campaigns, crit and self crit. These are essential. Rather than like covering up or brushing under the carpets horrific incidents or incidences, you can actually deal with them head on and work together. As you said, it's the responsibility of the organization, especially within MLM organizations, to make sure that these things aren't happening, that these issues are rectified and dealt with head on when they arise. So thank you very much for that. Really, really good answer. We'll take one more. We'll do one more Q&A, and then we will circle around, talk about getting organized. We'll wrap things up, do some shout outs, and so on and so forth. The last big question that I saw here was from SIO. Paul Moran, has Esperanza read Schumann? I can't pronounce this. Shulamit Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex? If so, what are her thoughts on or disagreements with Firestone's analysis of sex as a class system? We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier on, but do you want to speak to that question a little bit more now before we wrap up?
Yeah, so what I'll say is that although I have not done a careful study, I'm familiar with her ideas. And also Anuradha Gandhi in her book, Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement, does a really great job of critiquing it. One, she focuses on, women's biological essence as reason for her oppression. As communists, we follow the line of Kolontai, who said that women's oppression exists primarily because of social reasons and that natural or biological reasons are secondary, right? She also focuses on reproduction. We as communists focus on production. The question of women's emancipation is not simply economic, it's also political. And you cannot have a political analysis without understanding the importance of who controls and who owns the means of production, the means of producing and distributing wealth and resources in society. Additionally, she just sort of takes dialectical materialism and sort of works it into this idea of women as a class, which I think we as communists reject because we understand that class has to do with our relation to the means of production.
Absolutely. We touched on that a little bit earlier on as well. So if people are just joining the stream now, they can rewind and check that out a little bit later. Okay, listen, brilliant. That was a really, really good answer. This has been really useful, really informative, really educational for me. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about these things. Let's say someone is hearing about this for the first time now. They're hearing about proletarian feminism. It's being fleshed out before their eyes right now. They're more familiar with liberal feminism or with radical feminism or so on and so forth. How should people who are newly interested after hearing about this in proletarian feminism begin to get organized and to fight for women's emancipation?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on where you are in your conditions. If there is a proletarian feminist or Maoist movement, I think you should absolutely link up and join with them. If there is nothing where you are, I think that it is important to start, small study groups where you study the works of Anuradha Gandhi, where you study what Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao had to say on women's emancipation, where you study Kollontai and Clara Zetkin, and you don't simply study it, but you also investigate the conditions of your local area, and you begin to immerse yourself and organize the people around you. I think eventually, what I would love to see is sort of a proletarian feminist front develop, internationally, that is able to counter a lot of the identitarian, postmodern, liberal, and bourgeois trends in feminism, that's able to correct that and take in those women to join our movement, because we are seeking a revolutionary transformation of society and not simply a few reforms here and there.
Mm, brilliant. As Ron Lennon fan in the chat said, join a Maoist org. Yeah, well, do what you can anyway. Do what you can to get involved in the genuine transformative movement, the communist movement, the movement for the transformation of the current state of things, and to abolish class society once and for all. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. This has been absolutely great. Just before we finally wrap things up, Esperanza, do you want to shout out any upcoming work? Tell people about upcoming projects, in real life work that you might be involved in, or writing that you've got sort of coming in the pipelines. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we finally wrap things up?
Yeah, so the first thing is that if you haven't already, I would really encourage you to read my work on the sex trade. I think that this is an issue that is so important for us as communists to really study. And the reason why is because it is one of the last areas where liberalism and liberal feminism remains unchallenged, right?
Mm.
These ideas of choice and agency divorced from the social structure that we live in. These sort of melding of class interests. We really see all of that in this issue. So please read, what I wrote on my Medium. I took a lot of time, a lot of heart to write it, and I would really appreciate it if you wrote it or if you read it and really sat with it. Another thing is that I'm working on a pretty large project where I am attempting to write a series of essays using proletarian feminism to understand the sexual commodification of women, to understand sexual violence, and what we have to do to move beyond it. So keep a lookout for that. Additionally, I'm an editor of this little LGBT Marxist magazine, Twink Rev, but we are going to be rebranding. And in that, I'm going to be having a more regular show where I hope to interview people from the international communist movement. I linked my interview with Ray from the Philippines. I'm hoping to do more things like that, and just really, propagate people with the international communist movement and what's happening. So thank you, comrades, and it was really nice to talk to you today.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I can definitely strongly recommend your writing as well. I've put a little link to it in the chat there, to your Medium. People should definitely read this. It's often a very difficult read. I will be honest. There were moments when I was reading this and I had to just like step away, take a second, and just kind of process everything, because it's often quite horrific. The kind of things that you're describing from your time within the sex trade, and it's definitely, I think, probably going to change a lot of minds on the issue. So I would definitely recommend that. You'll find a link in the description box below. Some people have said that the link is broken. I'll update that as soon as the stream's over for anyone who's watching us back a little bit later. Please do check that out. It's really fantastic work, really important work, and we all need to be engaged in this. Anyone who sort of considers himself any kind of progressive, any kind of socialist or communist needs to deal with this question head on, and don't be afraid to deal with it as well. So listen, thank you so much, Esperanza. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much to the people who've watched this, who's tuned in this evening. Everybody have a great weekend. Cheers, everybody. Lots of love, solidarity, and slán go fóill. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye, comrades.